Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Goose webinar. Today, we're going to be talking with um, Damon Stone. He is a longtime developer. Damon Stone has been developing games and designing all types of uh, games of all different types, including complex strategic trading card games, light board games, historical conflict simulations for over 12 years, with over 100 released products. If you look on his Board Game Geek list, some of his titles include games from the Game of Thrones series and other ones that you probably do recognize. He prides himself on creative solutions to complex problems and marrying the themes and mechanics to create a more intuitive and immersive game experience. So, everybody, welcome to our speaker, Damon Stone. And before I hand it over to him, just as you guys are coming in, please put any questions you have in the chat. We'll try and insert them at a natural point. And if not, Damon will get to them at the end of kind of his prepared statement. So without further ado, Damon, please take it away.
Hi, everybody. It's a real honor to be here in a chance to speak to you. So as you are all aware, my topic of conversation today is on mechanics and theme, specifically synergies in game design, how the two elements can really work well together and make a better game for both the player and a better experience for designing for the designer or developer. So I want to talk about what comes first. It's very much sort of a chicken and egg situation. The question that I am asked most as a designer by people who are new or interested into getting into game design is, which do I come up with first, a game's mechanics or a theme? And for me, it is almost always theme first. The one spot where you can kind of say that I come up with mechanics first is when I'm struck with an idea for a specific mechanic or mechanism, which frequently happens when I'm playing someone else's game. And either it's working in a way that I find just really pleasurable, and I'm like, I really want to try my hand at using something kind of like this, or I'm really frustrated with how it's working, either the kind of abstraction that it's being used for, or the particulars of that given mechanic. I'm like, I would redesign this mechanic in this way, or I would create a mechanic for this kind of abstraction, this kind of simulation in this way. And anytime I do something like that, I have a long running document, just, a Google Doc that I stick those different mechanical ideas down. And when I have a theme and I'm trying to figure out a good way to abstract some specific aspect of it, if something isn't immediately presented, I'll go through, the Rolodex, that is that Google Doc, and I'll see if there's anything in there that I think can be adapted to the particular theme at hand. But generally, the choosing of a theme informs every decision that I'm making in one fashion or another. Now, I know some of you are experienced game designers, some developers, some of you are very interested in it, but have not yet really dived deep into it. And some of you are very steeped in specific niches of board games. We want to talk just briefly about two of the significant divisions in the hobby entertainment side of board gaming. And the divisions are German, sometimes referred to as Euro style, and American style games. German styles most often have no or only indirect player interaction, frequently use abstract physical components, and have a very light theme. A criticism that is often aimed at them is that the theme is replaceable and pasted on. Not every Euro game is like that. It is, however, a common criticism that a number of them face, even if it's not necessarily true. The theme itself is often secondary to the mechanics, in some cases tertiary or quaternary. This is contrasted with American style board games. They're most often rooted in conflict with a fair amount of direct player interaction and a more immersive style, frequently involving story or a narrative that is part of the context, either the history leading up to the beginning of the game, or that the game itself is intended to simulate a specific narrative. So examples of German style games include Agricola, Carcassonne, and Power Grid, whereas examples of American style games would be things like Diplomacy, Dune, and Twilight Imperium. Some of the other major distinctions between these two types of games are the use of randomness and the determination of a winner. With German style games, designers generally reduce the amount of randomness, often limiting it to game setup or resource availability during gameplay. And which increases the need for strategic analysis, what you have available to you, when you're going to be able to gain additional resources, and how you're going to be able to maximize your strategy. What are your optimal lines of play? American style games frequently have multiple random elements, forcing adaptive strategy and dynamic play. Tactics becomes very important in most American style games, even those that are categorically heavy strategic games. German style games will frequently eschew player elimination and will frequently go out of the way to obfuscate who's actually in the lead in the game, using multiple methods of determining the final victory point total after a predetermined number of rounds or a arbitrary condition has been met that is mandated by the gameplay itself. American style games, on their hand, frequently embrace player elimination, and the winner is often determined by the last player standing, or they end after the first player has achieved a specific win condition. Luckily, neither German nor American style games require mechanics at the expense of theme, or have the mechanics that perfectly simulate a theme. And so what a lot of the strongest and most well-designed and frequently the most popular games have some level of hybridization between the Euro style mechanics with the embrace of immersive and narrative elements that create something that's not quite a German style, not quite an American style of game. So a game based on, how do I explain this? I always suggest to game designers to decide on a theme as early as possible. And doing that allows you to craft the mechanics that create a game flow that actually resembles the player's in-game identities, their action choices. So a game based on squad combat enables the designer to choose mechanisms for movement and tactical decisions, gaining of intelligence, utilizing environmental factors to impact player interaction and even player choice. And conflict resolution could reflect, the specifics of armed units and how that kind of engagement would work. narrowing it down to things like a general period of time and place in history, or if you're dealing with a fictional IP, oh, I'm doing a game about Star Wars, and we're doing, the original trilogy versus we're doing, the prequels versus the more recent elements. By being able to focus on a particular time period, it really helps direct all of the choices that you're going to be having in regards to who the players are going to be, what kinds of options are available to them. It will frequently even lean itself towards choices about whether something should be symmetrical or asymmetric, whether it is team-based, or if you're going to have multiple factions that are at odds with each other. And on the flip side of something that would be a direct conflict simulation, you have a game based on brewing beer in a Trappist monastery. And you could choose mechanics that are based around growing or purchasing grain, gathering water, cultivating yeast, and actually brewing the beer, bringing it to market. And all of the choices that you're making about the mechanisms that are going to reflect those elements could reflect the same practices and the history of the real Trappist breweries. So the sooner that you can come up with an actual theme, it really can help focus all of your creative energies in making a game that makes sense to somebody who is familiar with those topics, that particular theme. So one of my latest games that I've designed is called Liberation Haiti, and it deals with the lead up to and then the first 3 years of the Haitian Revolution. And because of the choice of the who, the when, the where, and what was decided first, I knew I needed a mechanic that would simulate the preparation for the revolution. And that was something that, having played various conflict simulations, various war games, I note that a lot of them really center on the actual physical conflict, the war, the insurrection, the revolution, and not on the preparation before the first shots are fired. And so I really wanted this particular game to hit differently. And so I made the choice of deck building. And that was because it allowed for the luck of opportunistic raids, theft, foraging, that frequently governed the results of enslaved Africans' efforts to gain material and to recruit other fighters to their cause. Knowing what the deck building was intended to represent really helped determine how I was going to implement the deck building itself. So, there's numerous forms of deck building that can be done, and countless numbers of variations on these major pillars of it. And knowing what exactly I was trying to simulate really helped cut out a lot of things I didn't have to consider. Like, it just didn't make sense to have a set market where everybody had equal access to the same cards for the entire preparation, for the entire planning phase. There needed to be that uncertainty of what was going to be coming. If you're raiding a particular plantation in an attempt to gather guns and food, machetes, swords, farming implements that can be turned into weapons, you only ever had a basic idea of what might be available at that particular plantation in general, and what was going to be able to be taken under the nose of overseers and not going to tip them off that there was an upcoming revolution, was incredibly varied from plantation to plantation, or even on the same plantation, but multiple occasions separated by days, weeks, or months. So the idea of a constant changing market that was going to be impacted by each person before you who bought cards was a natural fit. And I think it's important to recognize that a skilled designer can oftentimes take any random mechanic and manipulate it to simulate the thematic element of their choice. But players usually don't have that same kind of ability to take a predetermined mechanic or shoehorned mechanic and intuitively understand the how and the why. And that can create a disconnect that substantially increases the cognitive load of the player. And the more thinking they have to do to remember what the rules of the game are, the less thinking they can put into the tactics and strategies to implement within the game. If I know,
Damon, sorry,
please, no, go
we
ahead.
just had a quick question about particularly your Liberation Haiti game from Robert. He wonders if there's a card that only affects like European players that decimates the card in his hands, replicating the effects of disease on European troops sent to Haiti. And other similar mechanics?
It's a great question. And the answer is sort of. I think there's a couple things to sort of like talk about before I address the very specific issue, and that is a lot. The Haitian Revolution is not truly well understood by a lot of people who have been writing about it for the last 100 years. There has been a very skewed perspective where only the French perspective was looked at and frequently interpreted from a modern, or at least at the time when it was being written, a contemporary context. So the enslaved Africans also had losses to yellow fever and malaria, but their losses were substantially less. And the reason why is because it was a very specific tactic that they were using to trap the forces of the colonial and French armies within the cities during the fever seasons. And so when you have a lot of people who have not had exposure on a low level or a high level, and therefore have no ability for their bodies to fight off these diseases, and you pack them in the heat and the humidity in a very small space, and every time they try to leave, you're running just a series of rolling raids against them, forcing them back into the walls of these forts and these cities. These outbreaks were planned for. Like, it was not accidental. So what we have are event cards in the game that will show yellow fever or malaria or famine. They're called the tragedy symbols. And when they pop up, you have to find a way to deal with them. It's just that you as a player have more ways to be able to compensate for how they're going to affect you. Whereas the automated system for the game cannot respond. And therefore it has a much larger negative impact on the automated forces, especially if you can get the enemy forces and the plantation forces all to congregate into the same districts, into the same ports, into the same cities. It has a much heavier impact when you can actually replicate the same kinds of strategies that were used by the revolutionaries. So I hope that answered that question.
Thank you very, very much for that question. Just a follow-up from me personally. You talked a lot about the importance of finding a theme before sitting down to design the mechanics and how the game actually works. How did you arrive at the Haitian Revolution as your theme for your most recent game? And then also a little bit, sometimes the cart comes before the horse. Do you ever look, when looking around at other games, you think, wow, that system's really great, I think it would be really good if I applied it to X, Y, and Z scenario or theme and kind of maybe skip a step. I don't know. Do you ever run into that as a designer?
Honestly, almost never. I mean, so when I find a game that really hits, that I really enjoy, the way the mechanisms and the systems interlock, I can be inspired by that, and like I want to create, my own version of this game. Like I like the way this thing feels. I like these ideas. But it only serves as a point of inspiration. When I actually sit down to design, I concentrate on the experience that I had, far more than the mechanics themselves. Partially because just copying and pasting mechanics, and making small alterations and retheming it is on the industry side very frowned upon. You don't really have a real ability to patent, or otherwise protect the intellectual property rights of your mechanics and your systems. And so there is a lot of a general just sort of understanding between designers and developers across the the industry, that if you've come up with something that is super interesting and a system that is very, unique, that we're going to leave it alone, that we're not going to just take it, break down a couple parts, swap them out for something else, and then slap our name on it and say, hey, look, I created this game. It's called Dawn Struggle, which is wholly and legalistically different than Twilight Struggle. Designing a game is equal parts art and science. And the art part matters to me, and it matters to most of the designers that I know. We take pride in our ability to actually create something. If I were entirely smitten by a set of mechanics and I really wanted to use those mechanics, I would contact the publisher or designer or whoever has this specific rights to it, and I would license it. Most designers are, if they own the rights to their game, are really generous, saying like, hey, give me credit in the rule book as inspiration for this, and a 1% of your sales. And it's like, yes, great, awesome, no problem at all. And others are like, yep, here's what my standard thing is. It's X amount of dollars and it's licensed, and you can do this for 5 years, 10 years, 3 years, what have you. But again, like I do view the games that I design as artistic, as creative endeavors. So as much as I might love a game, I don't want to take someone else's work and then just adapt it to my own, at least not without involving them in the process somehow. That said, Agricola is one of the most lauded, most well-loved of the German style games. And I do not care for it. I can't get excited about the theme of being a medieval French farmer. And some aspects of the themes and the mechanics just clash for me. And I keep threatening my wife, who it's pretty much her favorite game, that I'm going to redesign it to something that actually I find engaging, and then we can play that version of it. But even then, I would still feel the need to, I don't want to use the word fix, because, the game doesn't have, the game does not have any objective problems, but I would alter the parts of it that I don't particularly enjoy, that clash with the kind of experience that I want when I play games. So even then, it still would not be a direct one-for-one copy with just a new theme equally pasted on.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
I
For your
hope I actually
answer.
answered that question in there. I may
Oh.
have gotten tangential.
No, you're good. Thank you.
You're welcome. So it's important to me that the mechanics make sense in what they are representing, what they are, and how they're abstracted. And that really helps make games more accessible for people who don't consider themselves gamers. So there was a while back a lot of gatekeeping in gaming. In this particular instance, I'm referencing digital gaming. So, you know, computer and console gamers, really looking down on mobile gamers, and very specifically looking down on people.
Apologies.
Like, how long do you play, you know, a game for? And they're like, well, I play Call of Duty and I play it for, you know, 3 or 4 hours a day. I'm like, that's cool. Is the fact that you are like hardcore and you play it every day and you play it for a long period of time part of the thing that makes you a proper gamer? It's like, absolutely. And like, this friend of mine has, you know, an alarm to wake up at 3 a.m. to be able to properly, you know, deal with their farm for Farmville. She's got an alarm at 7 o'clock. She's got an alarm at, you know, was it 9 a.m.? She, you know, gets no more than 4 hours of sleep at a time because she wakes up to be able to play this game. Like, you can't tell me that the fact that she plays for, you know, the same amount of time, but not all at once, but repeatedly throughout a 24-hour period, makes her somehow any less dedicated of a gamer than you. But people who play, you know, things like Uno or spades, they're absolutely gamers. They just play a different kind of game. And getting those people into the kinds of games that we may all really love is about making things accessible, able to explain things in a way that does not require having played, you know, these other 4 or 5 types of games. So if I were going to have somebody play a war game for the first time, or a conflict simulation game, and I was going to sit them down to play a coin system game, they shouldn't have had to play 2 or 3 other coin games to be able to understand how this one works. Like, this game needs to be able to work and stand up on its own merits. And the more accessible that you can make the rules, the more that the actions that you're taking make sense given the theme, the easier it is for someone to be able to get it and to stay in the flow of the game, even as they're still learning the rules and trying to determine what is actually a good strategy versus a terrible strategy that first looks good, but only because you've never really played a full game through.
We have a quick question,
Yes,
David,
please.
from David. He said, since you've mentioned so many different other types of kind of games that are out there on the spectrum of gamers, have you worked with other gaming mediums such as like miniatures or role-playing rules? That's a question from David.
Yes. I used to work for Fantasy Flight Games, which is a very, very heavy American style game company. Their major IPs involve Marvel and Star Wars, Game of Thrones. They have a whole line of like Lovecraft mythos games. And I have had the pleasure of doing some playtesting for board games and role-playing games. I have uh, a role-playing game that I'm currently on my second design through that is based on it's a fantasy role-playing game based on the African diaspora folklore and mythology. So it takes myths and folklore from the Caribbean islands, from throughout Africa, which also includes North Africa, as well as throughout the US South, the West Coast, and the Midwest, and just sort of like takes it all and puts it into a vaguely medieval, so we'll call it 14th century equivalent. And if I were gonna like try and describe it to somebody, it's like imagine that the the Qataran, Nubian, and Moorish empires never fell and dominated all of Africa, the most of Europe, and heading, throughout all of the Middle East. That is the idea. So I have a pretty broad experience in design and development, but that is the first role-playing game that I am designing myself from scratch. I have done some additions for other people's role-playing games. I've done some cultural consulting, things along those lines.
I'm sorry, we just have one more follow-up question. This is
Yes.
on a little bit of a different one. This is from Milena. Can you describe your process for writing rules and how to make them better? Often it seems rules are written in the most dense and inaccessible ways that acts as a gatekeeping obstacle for many who try to learn games on their own and don't have someone to teach them well. Do you iterate rules? How do you approach this?
Iteration. I have a handful of people who I am blessed to know who are amazing editors, and a couple of them are hardcore gamers, and one of them is a more casual gamer, but is also a literary editor. And they go through and rip all of my nonsense apart and turn it into something that is much more accessible depending on the target audience. But the advice that I would give beyond the make friends with somebody who is an English major or a professional editor is to sit down and write the rules as you start the process of the game. So take all of the components and start to set up the game, and take notes of what you're doing to set up the game. That's your setup section. Take notes about what the process is for, that first turn. How many cards are you drawing? Where are you placing your pieces? Are you rolling the dice? Are you spinning the wheel? Whatever the particular thing is, just write all of the steps of actually playing out a round. And then take somebody who has not played the game before and then explain the game to them. And in this particular case, either have someone else write notes or record it. So it is you teaching someone else how to play the game. And I'll take a look at the thing that you wrote when it was just you playing yourself and compare it to how you were explaining things to this, other person. and take a special note of the questions that they ask and when they ask them. A lot of people are bad at learning, and a lot of people are very impatient, and so they will ask questions entirely out of context. To get information that they want to know, but is absolutely not necessary for them in that moment. But that doesn't mean that knowing that is something that someone is wondering about at this point can't impact how you are phrasing the segment of the section that you're in right now. So if I'm talking about how, the Alpha faction plays their cards, and they want to know about how the Bravo faction plays it, then maybe it says, maybe at the beginning of the section, you state, because it's an asymmetrical game, each faction has a different set of actions available to them. We will start with the Alpha faction and move all the way through Gamma. Great. Now, anybody who's reading that knows, like, well, I'm playing Bravo. I don't have to pay attention to Alpha. I'm just going to flip through to where it talks about Bravo. And like, that's not great for a long-term play, because you need to know what the other players are capable of doing. But knowing what you're going to do can sometimes help contextualize the importance of the choices that your other players are going to be making. So that's how I tend to go about it. I just really think about explaining the game. What do I need to know? And when do I need to know it? And trying to write my rule book that way. I'm also a real big fan of very casually worded learn to plays, something that is as much general common parlance and not super gamey language. And I save all of that more for the rules reference or for an in-depth or advanced guide. Sometimes you might have like a quick start, and the quick start will actually automate most of your first turn for you. That kind of thing is really great, again, if you're trying to make a game that's super accessible. And again, I would really use as common everyday language as possible, and save all of the more technical elements for your rules reference or your advanced guide to play. I hope that helps.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Of
And
course.
if you have time for one more question before you continue,
Absolutely.
we have Garrett, who asks, do you think marrying mechanics and theme are easier or harder for IP-based games?
That's a really great question. And for me, I'm going to say it's much easier. But I understand that is for me, and for them it might be much harder. We're all different, and our brains work in fascinating and very different ways. But if I have, like, when I was designing expansions for a Game of Thrones, I knew those books inside and out, and I always had the ability to, fire off an email or do a meeting with George, the author of the series, and pull from that those sources what the heart of a faction would be. Like, who is Oberyn Martell and who is Doran Martell, and how are they different from each other? For my Game of Thrones nerds, yay, you understand what I'm talking about. For everybody else, don't worry about it. You have two people who belong to the same faction. They're distinctly different, and each of them in their own way is part of the head of that faction. But they need to operate in very different manners, and creating something that feels like the Red Viper and creating something that feels like the Son of Dorne is very important. And because I knew those characters and I love those characters, it was really easy to go like, oh, okay, Doran is the plotter, and he's got, plots within plots and wheels within wheels, and he takes like generational view of conflict. The Red Viper is a hothead and loves to poison people and looks for any opportunity to make people pay for perceived wrongs. And so creating mechanics that fit him and that personality was really easy when you don't have a set IP, which also has direct parallels to historical events, right? Like if you were doing Custer's Last Stand, I mean, we know what happened, we know who the players were, we have a real solid idea of who Custer was in regards, if nothing else, to just the strategic and tactical choices that he had made in multiple other battles, as well as the flaws with the plans here, and creating faction abilities, or if he's an actual like leader card that has some sort of effect, you can drill down and make something that entirely makes sense for anybody who knows who Custer was. But saying like, oh, if you play this particular card, you get to do this thing that never happened, and there's no parallel to it in any other battle in regards to tactics or strategies that he utilized. It feels weird. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit. And that stands out. And people who are your play testers, if they're at all familiar with the IP or the historical event, they will let you know. But when it's something that you've created, on your own, it exists only in your mind, it's really easy to do a scattershot method. It's like, oh, this faction does not really feel like a particular faction. They've got 12 different abilities, 8 of which exist in the other 5 factions to some amount. Like, who is the Alpha faction, and how are they different than Bravo? How are they different than Charlie and Delta? Like, if the factions don't have something that makes them feel different on some level, why have that faction? And so having to create a faction and you're essentially having to create an IP as you're designing a game. And when you don't have that, you end up with mechanics that don't make sense. Like falling back on Agricola, for anybody who's played it, they know what I'm getting ready to, they'll understand the reference. You have a house and you are raising farm animals, and you can keep one animal in your house, and your house starts off as one room. And you have the ability to add rooms to your house. You have abilities to upgrade it from like clay to brick to stone, or wood to stone. And you have pigs, sheep, and cattle as examples of the farm animals available. A sheep is going to be so big, and a cattle is going to be so big. And if if my house has 4 rooms in it, why can't I keep 4 animals? Or why can't I keep 1 sheep in each of them, but a cattle actually have to have 2 rooms? Like, there is no direct correlation as these different elements change. The rule is just set as, just one thing, 1 animal in your house, regardless of what the animal is, and regardless of how big your house is or what it's made out of. Like, these elements just don't quite carry over. The theme at those points starts to break down. The only time I've actually won that against my wife, who is a bit of an Agricola shark, is when I completely just stopped thinking about the theme and I only thought about optimal lines of play. And that makes me sad, because I want playing the game, utilizing the theme to show me what the optimal lines of play are. So I had a lot of kids and I didn't feed any of them. I went for a starvation method and I got the highest score out of that game. And she had 20, 30 plays. And this was the highest score that she'd ever seen. It was a ridiculous score and it should have never happened, because having kids that you can't feed should not allow you more actions, because it's a worker placement game. Like, you should lose those workers if you can't, pay for them, because starvation is a thing. But in this game, it just gives you a very small amount of negative points. And if you use the right strategy, you can turn those negative points actually into positive points. It's a whole thing. And it always kills me when I see games that are like that, where the IP is not well refined. And so, the abilities and the mechanics don't gel well. So I personally find it much easier to have a very specific IP, therefore a very hard theme with a lot of restriction around it that I can get creative within. I do believe that restrictions breed creativity. And the fewer restrictions you have, the more likely you are to deal with things like writer's block or analysis paralysis, where there's just so many options. You have a really hard time of zeroing in on something and then being able to stick with it.
Thank you for the excellent response.
Wow. You're welcome.
Very detailed. We've got one more question, but I think that one can wait. It's a little bit of a longer one.
Okay.
Wait till you finish your other comments.
All right. Obviously, when you design games, you're going to have to figure out who your target audience is. And I talked about people who don't really consider themselves gamers. There are swaths of people who the most complicated game they've played is Uno or Monopoly, and they'll have family game nights. They'll have regular game nights where they'll have friends over, and it'll be Trivial Pursuit. It'll be Monopoly. It'll be Sorry. It'll be things along those lines. Your Milton Bradley and Parker Brothers, your Hasbro games versus Hasbro's Wizards of the Coast style games. And those people, they love games as much as we do. They just need the right introduction. And so you have things that are like entry level games, something like Carcassonne or Catan. And, those games are very light. They're easy to wrap your head around. You have games that are light, but still pretty tactical or strategic, that also are very beautiful to look at, such as Azul or Hive. And those games have a very limited level of complexity. And there is a beauty in simplicity. And this is something that is my current passion. And it's also the thing that I struggle with the most, which is just the beauty of simplicity. And that's not to say that you can't make a complex game that is accessible. You don't need to water a game down to make it accessible. It just requires focusing on where you're choosing to add your complexity. The more complexity you have in column A, the less complexity there can be in column B without negatively impacting who can enjoy your game. And if column A is the rules are very complex, then column B is your playing, your player interaction, and that can't be very complex. And not if you want to reduce the cognitive load and you want to make your games accessible. I like to swap that. I like to have rules that are as simple to understand as possible, so that the gameplay, your player interaction, your decision trees are as complex as possible. And for me, like chess is sort of like the holy grail for that. Like chess is 10 rules, maybe 11 rules. And it's super easy. Like I can teach anybody chess in 5 minutes. But the actual playing of chess, the getting good at chess, like it's a lifetime to master. And as much as that is, constantly being said, it is also equally true. Knowing that, a pawn moves a certain way, knowing that a rook moves a certain way, knowing a bishop moves a certain way, and a king and a queen, and a knight, well, that's, a handful of pieces. That's, call it 5 rules. Knowing that the pawn moves in a certain way and then strikes at another is a 6th, knowing that you have to castle, knowing that you have the impasse, and you then you have zigzag. That's it. There are really no more rules. The rest of it is just okay, I moved my pawn. Now I've got, 20 other things that I can potentially do next. Each of those leads to another 20 or 10 or 32 different things. And so the complexity comes in the play and in the interaction between the players, rather than, well, I have 57 rules that I have to remember in order to sit down and play this game. And that is like the war for North Africa. It's like, yes, you have points, and the Italians require more water because, of pasta. If anybody is not familiar with this game, it is a site. It is definitely, I recommend everybody take a look into at some point, because it's a statement. It's a designer's statement about how complex and how simulationist something can be, and the fact that it is practically unplayable because of that level of complexity. I think it was calculated out to be something on the order of 24 hours of play necessary to complete the game at its most basic level. And like, that's crazy. That's ridiculous. I have a child and a job, and I don't have that much time to play anything. That's crazy. So recognizing where you're creating complexity is really important. One of my mentors, Nate French, talked about thinking about complexity as a bank. You were making deposits. Every time you make something simple and easy to understand and easy to explain and very intuitive, you're making deposits. And every time you are making something that is more complex, something that's got multiple stages of resolution, you're making a withdrawal, and you can't go into the negative. If you go into the negative, you are vastly limiting your target audience, and that's going to have a direct impact on your bottom line. And it's not that every game needs to be designed, and really, honestly, most games shouldn't be designed with a thought process for how much money can this game make and how expensive is it going to have to be. That's really more of a series of like developmental thoughts. Your developer, your project manager, your publisher will be the one who's going to really pay attention to that. But keeping in mind that the more complex your games are, the smaller your target audience gets, is important, because any given game is going to have a very specific core audience, and catering to them is just fine. But you should be aware of that there's a whole adjacent series of groups that by making some very small, simple changes, you can bring them into that bubble. And for me, I believe on a very deep level that synergizing by taking a theme and taking the mechanics and making them make sense with each other widens that potential pool of gamers. So next, I want to talk about how you can create that that self-reinforcement. The first thing is that if the subject of the game is something that has some amount of common knowledge or connection to pop culture, you can tie your game's theme into that. That's not to say that you can't deconstruct or critique or parody or even subvert the expectations of that particular theme. As a matter of fact, doing so is frequently a really good way to go. But there's still a certain level of expectations. So a game about vampires still has some elements that you could lean on, regardless if player A is a fan of Twilight and player B is, their favorite book is Bram Stoker's Dracula, and they have a doctorate in literature. So likewise, the game about the American Revolution carries some general knowledge about the British and colonialist factions, at least among British and US citizens. But when you're bringing in the French and the Spanish and Native Americans, you can broaden the scope of the understanding of the conflict without directly contradicting or dismantling that common knowledge. So finding what people think about that theme, what they know, what they consider related to it, and taking those elements and weaving them into your design, making the mechanics reflect that in some fashion, where if you understand that, oh, I'm making a game about vampires, and if this vampire damages this non-vampire, they heal. Like, everybody has some knowledge of that basic understanding, like, oh yes, vampires, they drink blood and they heal from damage and they're immortal unless you cut off their heads or drive a stake through their heart or you put them in the sunlight. And here's where, depending on what style of vampire, where your source is, things are gonna differ. But that idea that they drink blood and they're hard to kill, and tying those together by, if they successfully attack, they heal some amount of damage they've already had. It's a thing that people are they're gonna understand, and therefore it's a rule that they're not gonna have to reference in the rule book every time that vampire does damage. They'll just remember, it's like, it did 3 points of damage, so now it heals 3 points. Like, that is not a rule that they're gonna forget. And because it's so simple and so intuitive, because the mechanics and the theme match, you can create much more complexity somewhere else. Other places that you can create reinforcement is using asymmetry, which allows you to create individual associations between factions or player pieces, which can allow for a more complex understanding of the subject and what each faction is actually trying to achieve and why they're doing it. So like asymmetry in pieces would be, to go back to chess and
Damon, are you still with us? He did mention that he is in Italy right now and that his connection may be choppy. If any of you guys still have any questions, you guys can insert them in the chat while we wait for him to rejoin us.
All right. So I believe I was talking about asymmetry in regards to individual factions and pieces. Just getting ready to talk about the knight in chess. Remembering that you can move forward a certain number, and then in a direction, a lateral direction, another, a 3-1 or a 1-3 is not as easy to remember that the knight can jump over other people's pieces or over your own pieces. The idea that the knight is on a horse and the piece is a horse itself, we all know that horses can jump. And so the fact that it can jump over other pieces is not something that beginners their very first time playing chess forget once it's stated to them. It's a very easy thing to just from that point forward to intuit, to remember, which does allow for the more complicated movement itself to take up a little bit more of that cognitive load. Then we have use of narrative, which is, I think, one of the most powerful tools in reinforcing the theme of a game. In the two uses of narrative that stand out the most to me are extrinsic and intrinsic. For extrinsic, narrative elements would include a literary insert, an actual piece of fiction, or a blurb about a particular period of history that the game is directly related to or is simulating. And so reading that puts you in a very specific mindset, and it helps people remember. It's like, right, I am playing the British in the American Revolution, and these are my colonists who have decided to rebel, and I need to bring them to heel and remind them, that you are British citizens and you should be loyal to the crown. And so, that helps, but also recognizing, oh, I'm fighting this war across an entire ocean, getting troops there, getting supplies there is really difficult. And so I'm having to lean on other forces. I'm having to lean on the loyalists, and sometimes the loyalists are not actually loyal, and instead they're spies. It starts to that concept starts to bring in other mechanical elements that might be represented in the game, and that's exactly what you want from an extrinsic narrative. If you're using cards in your game, you can have flavor text that is on the cards that can describe the connection of that card, what it represents to the fiction or historical moment. For intrinsic narrative elements, we're dealing with things like stories in history that define stages of gameplay. So if you're doing a cooperative game about the Battle of Wabash, you could have progress at 3 different stages where the game changes after a certain number of rounds. So you're in stage 1, and that's the encirclement, and stage 2 is the siege of the army, Washington's army, and then you would have I should say St. Clair's army, and then you would have the breaking, which is where St. Clair's forces scattered, broke, they ran, and had to do a forced retreat. And knowing that the game itself is representing very specific things that happened in that battle really focuses the players and their strategies and their tactics in the moment, and it keeps the game flow in a way that they never lose sight of what the theme is. They are actively portraying, this band of Native American warriors, as opposed to like, yes, I am, this random gray plasticky bit that vaguely looks like somebody on a horse, and I'm just moving things around in a math problem. If I get 3 of my people over here into this space, then I'm going to win the conflict against their 1 piece. And that's the case of something for a game like Risk, which has a theme, but it's not really deeply baked into the mechanics. The mechanics sort of just like hold steady across the board. Intrinsic narration also includes things that like legacy or campaign elements or results of specific moments in a game will alter how that game is played in the future. And sometimes it's in that exact same game, and sometimes it's in the next time you play that game, or 2 or 3 times later that you play that game. There's been a permanent change. And so much so that you can sort of like reverse the abstraction, because I did this abstracted thing in my game, and now it has had this impact on the narrative element. And so it unpacks all of that, and it gives me a bit of story before it puts me back into the abstraction that is the mechanics of future play.
We had a quick question, actually. That was the question that was in the chat, was about legacy games from a mechanics perspective. Games that like Oath or like Pandemic that have like legacy mechanics. What is your opinion on those in terms of the kind of accessibility to players, and sometimes takes several times before players really get what legacy is all about? What was your opinion about that?
I love legacy games. I absolutely love them. They're definitely not for everybody. But to me, legacy games is a natural outgrowth of, or it's a natural evolution, I should say, of board gaming. One of the things that makes video games compelling is that you have a memory. My character dies and I have to go back to a save point. I can save my game and I can come back to it later, and everything is still the same. Completing a quest here and interacting with certain people and interacting with them in a very specific way is going to impact how I am able to interact with them in the future. Like, video games have been doing this for a exceedingly long period of time. I mean, given how long that industry has been around, that we really just started seeing it in the last decade and a half, and really start to come into its own in the last, call it 7 years. I think is fascinating. People who love a game of a particular type, and they want to sit down and they want to play it again and again and again and again and again and again, and they're going to do this for years. That is not what legacy games are for. Legacy games are for players who or for people who understand that when they play a game, they're probably going to spend 20, 30 hours of playtime, and they will probably not play the game beyond that. Game might take 45 minutes, the game might take an hour, and so they might play it 30 to 50 times, and then they give it away, they sell it, or it just sits on their shelf in a place of pride where they look at it and have fond memories, but never reach for it because they've got 20 new games that they have not played nearly as much, or for some of us who are maybe addicted to Kickstarter at all and are just waiting for that extra time when our child is off at preschool. And then we are going to sit down and we're going to play all the games. those players that recognize what I'm really looking for is an experience, one that I'm going to create some really cool moments. I'm going to have some great memories of, epic failures and epic wins. Like legacy games are a really great way to do it. One of the major detractions for legacy games, which, because of the pandemic has just like been tripled in some people's cases, in other ways, it's been completely alleviated, which is having people who are capable of needing to play that same game. If you start with 3 players, most legacy games require you to have those same 3 players for the entire run until you've completed that campaign. And, that can be really difficult. We're just all so busy in this day and age that getting together once a week, once every couple of weeks for, a handful of hours is the most that many of us can do, because we have so many other jobs and work and school and other hobbies that we do, and even other games that we want to play as much as we might like this one, that it could get to be difficult. But I think that there's something really rewarding about playing a game from beginning to end and looking back and having a unique experience that's different than anyone else who has played that same game. So I love them, but they are not for everybody. No game is for everybody. And I think it's a very important thing for designers to remember, because the more that you try to make your game appealing to everybody, the more likely it is to appeal to nobody.
Thank you very much for that thoughtful answer.
Absolutely. I think the very last bit that I want to talk about is components. So how your players interact with the physical game itself, they use the components, helps create a bridge. It helps the theme be reinforced. So it's one of the interesting things about legacy games is the creation of real tension, and in some people, even just like the slightest hint of like anxiety about I have to make a choice between A or B or A, B, C, or D, and whichever one I choose, I can't go back. I actually have to destroy, the other options. This is the only one that's going to be available. And I know people who just refuse. They're like, I'm going to play this game and I'm going to replicate everything. I'm just going to note on a book the choices that I make, so I can replay this game and try all the different choices. And, that is a distinct way of playing the game. And it is absolutely not the way that the game is designed. And it misses the most interesting aspect to me of legacy games, which is the psychological impact of making a decision that you can't go back on. Suddenly the choices that you make have weight, because you're going to be dealing with that choice for the next 2 or 3 months. And that's one aspect of it. Other aspects of it is like the graphic design of cards and boards and models and tokens can all keep people really like aware of what the theme is. And so can, box art and cards and rulebook art. And while they don't necessarily tie into the mechanics, removing 2 medium beige cubes from a specific place and replacing them with 3 dark beige, wood cubes, doesn't tell me anything. Like I don't have any connection. It's like, maybe I like dark beige more than I like light beige. It's just, it doesn't have any kind of impact. My brain has a hard time wrapping itself around and caring. But removing 2 TIE fighters and replacing them with 3 X-Wings does have meaning, and it does have impact, and it makes it more immersive for me. Like, it can't replace a strong mechanic that gives the feel of a dogfight in the upper atmosphere of, a planet. But it does go a long way to helping players visualize the conflict that they're simulating and staying in the moment. And that, X-Wing being moved across the board, and then, having to, use a ruler to show the arc of something, and, flipping cards over to simulate, blaster fire or what have you, really makes me stay in the idea of like, yes, I'm in a dogfight. I can see, my starfighter. So it is just another way of really immersing the player in the game. And that's really what theme is all about. And when you can immerse the player into the theme, you want the mechanics to be able to support that. Like, if you are, a fire team and you are headed down a jungle path, having to roll for, what your team is aware of or how much noise they're making, like, that makes sense in a way that just making arbitrary decisions about engagement that seem random do not. And I think that wraps up most of my sort of like planned words.
Thank you. If you all have any other questions, please put them in the chat. And so I'm just gonna have a few questions of my own for you. You've been really generous in answering all the questions that have been posed so far, but you've had a lot of variety in the themes that you've worked on, fictional, historical. What drives you in choosing your particular themes? Is it just something that catches your eye thinking, oh, there needs to be a game for that? Or how do you kind of come across the themes that you want to build games for?
It has to hold my interest. Like, it has to be a theme that I really groove on, because I'm going to be like immersed in that theme for months. And it's really easy for something that you're just sort of like moderately interested in, or like, hey, someone was telling me about this theme and it seemed kind of interesting, and so I thought I'd make a game about it. Or it's super popular right now, so I'm gonna make a game about it, even though I really don't care about this theme at all. Like, that's just torture. Like, if you're going to spend 3 to 6 months just on the design side of making a game about zombies, you should like zombies. And if you don't, your game is gonna almost certainly reflect that. If you're super into Napoleonic war, then knowing that you're going to be spending a lot of time researching the specific time period or the specific conflict, and then maybe looking at who the various officers were, and looking at what they did prior to that particular battle to get a sense of what options might be available to a player who has them as part of their faction. Like, it's going to be hell for something that you just have no interest in. So I'm always looking for something that is actively interesting to me, something that I really want to know more about, or something that I know a lot about, and I really want other people to know more about it, or know more about a particular piece of it. So for historical games, for me, there's so many historical games, and there's a lot of them that focus on the Napoleonic era, and that has very little direct interest for me as a designer, even though I find the subject really interesting. And the reason why is because it's been done so much. So the idea of taking something that is during that, at least adjacent to that time period, and touches on or is directly related to, but maybe separated a little bit, and having a very unique take on a complex simulation during the Napoleonic era is what Liberation Haiti is. It's like, yeah, okay, we have France, we have French army, we have French colonists, we have interactions that were originally intended to be covered in the game. The Liberation Haiti was originally going to be the entire war, and then I got more and more into it, and I started realizing that the way that I wanted to present this this game was not going to work running the entire revolution. It was just way too long. And I would have to simplify too much. It made much more sense to just narrow it down to the preparations for the revolution and ending with the declaration of the abolition of slavery, both in Haiti and throughout the colonies. Like, that became a good end point. So I never really got to go into, from a design perspective, go into what having Napoleon in charge of France looked like, and how that would impact how the automated French armies the enemy forces were going to act. But it was originally there, and that was part of what sort of like drove me there. But also, I had seen Hamilton, I think, for the third time, and was listening to something maybe on NPR about a really heavy renewal of interest in Hamilton and in Aaron Burr and just the founding fathers in general, and the American Revolution, and regardless of the pop nature and the arguable historicity of the play, the musical, versus the actual history, that so many people were moved to study and learn more about this conflict based on what had originally been a mixtape idea in regards to what if Alexander Hamilton were a rapper and he was going to do diss tracks about Aaron Burr. Like, that's where the whole musical idea started from, and like the idea that I might be able to make people really interested in the Haitian Revolution, particularly Americans, because so many of us just don't have a real strong understanding of the history of slavery and how it impacted our own nation, and how the Haitian Revolution had serious direct impacts on what the United States looks like today. Like, a lot of people just don't understand that. And so that was something, a drive that I had, that I wanted more people to recognize. And so I look for those themes, those things that inspire me, that I want to, that I've got a message, something that I really want to share with people. And again, like I said, part of game design is art. It is a creative process, and therefore you have to have something to say, even if it is about, like, I'm really passionate about birds, and I want people to learn more about birds as they are, creating their estuary.
That's great. Thank you for that answer. We have another question from Angus McDonald's, who asks, the politics of colonialism is a value-laden set of themes that you have taken on. Do you have any suggestions for mechanics to marry potentially controversial or sensitive themes?
Um, for me, it is less about mechanics, because, again, a talented designer can use just about any mechanic to simulate or abstract something out. And it's more about a very specific design ethos. And the first things that I would say is that if the story that you're telling is not your own, it's not one that you were directly connected to and impacted by in some fashion, think that maybe it's not the story or subject that should be yours to tell solely. Bringing in a designer who is a cultural expert, someone who's directly tied to that, is going to make for a better game. They are going to know aspects of it that just don't occur to you, things that you won't find in the most cited sources. So like with Liberation in Haiti, I talked to a number of academics and people who specialized in the Americas and the Caribbean revolutions. But I also talked to actual Haitian people, both academic and lay, about the Haitian Revolution, about the heroes of that revolution. Who were they to them? And like tried to bring those views into, my design. So, it's not necessary to have, I don't have a Haitian designer, I have Caribbean in my, in my family, in my ancestry, but not specific Haitian. So I sought out those voices and I ran the things that I was looking at by them. I took their critiques and I treated them as if they were my boss. And this is a thing where using cultural consultants is a thing that I'm constantly suggesting to people when you're dealing with a culture that's not your own. But because those people are usually getting paid by you, they are very frequently going to put forward things that they feel strongly about as if they were suggestions. Like, oh, you might want to think about this, or this term, might be better replaced with this other thing. If they're people that you're paying because they are experts, you should take their word as absolute, and you should just do the thing that they're suggesting. And you should then run it by them again to make sure that it's the proper implementation of it. Because not doing that causes, problems where, Puerto Rico involves, having the players go like, yes, if I employ slaves here, these little round cubes, I'm going to get a bonus. And like that should not be abstracted out. Like if you're going to have that be a part of the game, then I think that needs to have weight. It should not be trivialized. I would never say that no player or no designer or the designers can't make a game about whatever subject that they want. I don't fundamentally believe that. I just think that there's the understanding necessary of what is the actual subject, what is the point. For my game, it was really important that the players had agency. The revolution that happened was created entirely within the enslaved and the escaped enslaved Africans within the colony of Saint Domingue. It was important that nobody was playing the French because I didn't want anybody to have to play the role of a slaver. And frankly, anybody who really, really wanted to play that kind of role, I didn't want to be at a table playing with that person. It's the reason why most World War II conflict simulations are things that I just can't get interested in myself. So I would say make sure that the players have agency, that the historical representation that you're doing of a weighty topic, or even if it's being done in a fictional fashion. So it's not specifically about history, but maybe it's a fictional setting dealing with an abstracted or paralleled version. So, you know, the X-Men, you know, originally being about civil rights, and then specifically for Black people, and Professor Xavier being a stand-in for, you know, Martin Luther King, and Magneto being a stand-in for Malcolm X. Like, you can go that direction, but it's really important that the people whose stories are being told are done so in a way that's respectful, and it gives them agency, as opposed to things just happening to them. And again, this is where talking to people who were impacted by that is going to give you the best information.
Thank you for that answer. I think that wraps up our the questions that we have from our audience. Everybody, I would just take a moment to say in the chat, thank you to Damon for taking time to come and speak to us. I just want to also note to everybody that we will have a recording of this video available on our YouTube channel sometime in the next day. Damon, do you have any last comments before we end the recording?
That if you have a desire to make a game, you should make a game. You should make lots and lots of games. Sometimes people who are newer designers think to themselves that, like, oh, there are already so many great games and I'm struggling trying to figure out how to do this one. It's like, yours is that next great game. Somebody is going to play your game, is going to think it's just the best thing ever, and you should not deny them that experience.
With that, thank you. I'm going to just stop the recording right now.